This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses.
So it was a bit of a weird week for me last week because I don't ordinarily get to go and just see other bands playing that much, but last week I got to see Adam Neely's band Sungazer with Josh de la Victoria, and that was a Bristol Trinity, I think it was called. And I also got to see then Bilmuri play at Bristol's SWX, and there was a support band called South Arcade. Now, these were fairly different styles of music across the board, so sax is involved in two of them. But the interesting thing for me was that none of these bands were actually using an amp live. And I had to think back to when I actually saw someone using an amp live, and it's quite a while ago. I saw Charlie Allen playing with Incognito, and he used a Fender Twin. And prior to that, I think it would have been Jonathan Kreisberg using a deluxe reverb, and prior to that, it would be Gilad Hexelman using a deluxe reverb as well. But the younger, I guess, younger bands, you know, like Sleep Token, I'd seen Jack Gardner, Pliny, Jacob Zatecki. Like most of the gigs that I'm seeing these days, no one's using an amp, and that's kind of really interesting to me. Charlie Allen with Incognito, now that's a big band. It's kind of like fusion jazz fusion, but with horns and stuff like that. Actually, he had his Fender Twin on 4, and it wasn't like loud at all, really. It could have been louder. You could hear him, but like it wasn't overpowering or tall or anything like that. That's a band actually where they still use monitors on stage and stuff like that. And Bluey from the band has obviously been there a while, and so it's kind of doing things the way they would have been done back in the day as well, I guess. Then Jonathan Kreisberg, it's like a jazz gig where actually volumes are pretty tame. Jazz gig volumes aren't going to be crazy at all, but you know, a lot of those guys will be using amps. And same for Gilad Hexelman. This was years ago, like, that I saw him at Ronnie Scott's. But then if you think about bands like Sleep Token, I think they were on Quad Cortex at the time. You know, Bilmuri used Quad Cortex. Jacob Zatecki was using Helix. You got Jack Gardner was using Quad Cortex. There's a really variable results with this. So when I saw Sleep Token, all I could really hear through front of the house was like a really big bass and kick, you know, drums are loud, and then vocals. and quite a bit of track, but the guitar was kind of lost in that situation. It's quite easy to get lost in a situation like that anyway, but I don't think the modelling part of it necessarily is totally to blame, but I don't think it really helps, because your front of house guy's got so much else to worry about. Bilmuri, there were moments where it was kind of difficult, like on the riffs and stuff, like because there was bass on track, you would hear a lot of bass, and vocals were pretty crisp. The sax was actually pretty loud too, but not a ton of guitar. Even for like the guitar solos were like quieter than the sax relatively. Now I think a sax would be a more difficult instrument to actually get sounding like loud live, because you'd have things like feedback and stuff, but actually the sound guy was on it and was able to get that sax blaring, and like above the vocals you could really clearly hear it, but the guitar not so much, a bit quieter. And for Sun Gazer, that I think was one of the best sounding situations with Josh. Amazing guitarist. He was playing a headless guitar with a set of Fluence pickups in it, I think it was, but that had some really interesting sort of tonal qualities where sometimes, because it was like semi-hollow headless guitar, sometimes sounded kind of like a nylon guitar, but when it needed to be like louder for his solos, this was the thing. I think the sound guy was just pushing it up, like, and I think this is maybe one of the things that needs to be done when there's not an amp on stage, is that when you really want the guitar to be heard, you want to push it up. And I've noticed this with my buddy Jake, who gigs with the Sir Bello, who I gig with. It's when he needs to be heard, you will hear him. And I think that's one of the things that with the modelling stuff, because it just doesn't need to be as loud necessarily, a sound guy is not going to slam it up hugely loud, and it probably won't be quite as loud as what a real guitar amp would be through the front of house or into the room. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like, okay, well that is actually really loud, and given the choice, maybe other people like listen to the band would go, right, can we take that down a bit? But in terms of it sounding really good in the room, and actually being to the level where you can hear like great dynamics in their playing, I think it does kind of help. I think still to either have things coming through quite loud through front of house, or have a real amp. That's kind of what I'm experiencing, at least. And yeah, different genres and different stuff like that, but that's been the thing. What I'm noticing is that bass is really, really present and loud at these gigs, and you know, they're coming slamming through the subs and stuff, and a lot of these kind of like dark glass type tones where actually they've got quite a lot of mid-range honk to them as well. The guitars are actually like kind of getting lost. Maybe that's not the worst thing in the world, but for me, when I'm at a gig, you know, sometimes I'm just thinking, why can't I hear the guitar? And I don't know if any of you guys are like that as well, but for me, especially at like a metal gig or something like that, I think we could do with having the guitars up a bit louder in the mix, especially if we're using a modeler, because I think you're getting lost a bit. I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments, and who was the last person that you saw using a real amp live if you go to gigs. I'd be interested to know that. Jonathan Kreisberg again last night, and it's kind of made me think about this a bit differently, because Jonathan was super like present in the mix last night with the deluxe reverb. He had a deluxe reverb at Ronnie Scott's, and like I could hear him the whole night, but there was times when it was like, okay, well that's a bit loud versus the piano. And I think this is maybe like the other side of this coin, where like for years and years, you know, sound men have been saying, can you turn that guitar down? They've not had any control over it, and now like the shoe is on the other foot, where suddenly now the sound man has, you know, ultimate control over the guys using modelers. Now we can control that guitar. Let's just have that a little bit quieter. I do think in some ways, so none of the gigs were particularly loud, but what I do notice is it's not like drums are any quieter at gigs, and these bass tones that are getting used now at gigs are like, they're filling up so much of the spectrum. You know, vocals aren't any quieter. It's just the guitar which has come down, I think, in volume, in my opinion, because you've lost that amp on stage thing, and you've lost some of that. So it's kind of interesting from that point of view as well, where it's like actually the rest of the band is relatively, you you know, the volume's not come up. Like, drummers aren't playing any quieter than they used to sort of 5 years ago, are they? In my experience anyway, having played with a few. But that just made me think about it again, because it's like I was at a gig where the guitar was super high in the mix, and then at sometimes you're thinking, right, I could do with hearing a bit more piano, particularly if the piano is taking a solo. So it's like, well, someone needs to ride that volume there. So maybe it's about having like a more sensitive sound guy who's going to, you know, when you really want to hear any of the instruments, just give it that boost. Maybe that's something I've noticed with piano players a lot, actually. Like, there's not so much, because you don't have a pedal to kick on for your solo. You do really need someone else to sort of just go, right, we're going to kick up the volume there to really get you heard. It's probably now the same for guitar, right? Because there's not as many amps on stage.